All right, we are talking, of course, about the Ten Commandments, and we have been, close the door for us. All right, so we have been talking about the Ten Commandments for some time now, and we're looking at the fifth commandment, honor your father and mother. And so we've looked at a number of different passages that talk about this. We've looked at the Old Testament and some of the laws and commandments in the Old Testament involving what happened if you didn't obey your parents and some of that kind of stuff. And now we're looking a little bit in the New Testament, and we've come to Ephesians, where Paul talks about the importance of children obeying their parents. And he says, honor your father and mother. And he says it's the first commandment with a promise. What was the promise?
You'll live long in the land.
Okay, you'll live long in the land. And I think, as I mentioned, there's kind of two ways you could look at that. You could look at it as the Lord will prosper you, and you will, as a people, you will live long in the land. Or it could be, individually speaking, if you don't obey that commandment, you're not going to live very long in the land because your parents are going to drag you in front of the gate and they'll stone you. So one way or the other, it's definitely relevant. So he says, but he actually then states the promise that it may be well with you and that you may live long on the earth. So notice here that he is not simply restating the commandment in the sense of you have heard it said the way Jesus used to or something. He is stating that as a commandment to be followed. He is telling Christians that they should honor their father and mother, that it may be well with them, and that they may live long on the earth. So this is not something that is pushed back into the old covenant. This is something that Paul carries forward into the new covenant. And we talked about seeing Jesus do this. We talked about seeing Jesus talk about how the Pharisees were finding ways to avoid this. And so it's very clear when we look at it under these circumstances that, in fact, the commandment to obey our parents is something that continues through to Christians today. And it's not something that we can get around by saying, well, we're not under the old law anymore. Because even under the new law, even under this new law of grace, there is still an expectation.
I think another dimension of it is that the Ephesian audience was primarily Gentile, and they didn't have centuries of conditioning with the Ten Commandments.
Yes.
So now Paul is picking from these things, okay, here's how you should live as a Christian.
Yeah. And in fairness, the society in which the Ephesians lived was much more, in this regard at least, was probably much more similar to the Jewish society than it would be to our modern day society. The Gentile society of the time was typically still relatively family-based. People didn't tend to go long ways away from their households real often. There was some of that, but still tended to be not just a nuclear family, but an extended family that tended to live either in the same area or even in the same house. And so it wouldn't be as stark a difference between the Gentiles and the Jews when it comes to this as it would be some of the other stuff that in particular the Judaizers would try to come in and teach these Gentiles. And there certainly is probably a much bigger difference between how we are today and how the first century was in general than there was between the Jews and the Gentiles on this situation, both in terms of the that's what I'm looking for. We have a very mobile society. We have a very mobile society so that it is easy to move from one place to another. It is easy to take a job and go from one place to another. It is not at all uncommon. In fact, it's much more common for all of the children of a family to be scattered across the country or even the world than it is for all of them to live in the same household or even in the same city. So the reality is that we live in a world that's much more dispersed, and we also live in a culture that is much less respectful of parents. And children are in general accorded a level of importance in our society that is absolutely abnormal relative to the history of the world. You don't have to go back that far to see where children were basically disposable assets. And not disposable in the sense that you were allowed to kill them, but in the sense that they tended to die off pretty regularly. Either when they were young or when they got older in farm accidents or different things like that. They tended to be viewed in terms of their value to the family, not in terms of their value as human beings, until they got old enough to actually act like human beings. And so there was a very different perspective, and I'm talking about 100 years ago. I'm not talking about 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago.
Child labor laws came into existence for that very reason.
Yes.
They were being worked to death, literally.
Yes. Yes.
Some of the factories.
and the standard of the salaries that were being paid to workers took into account that these kids would be working, and that's how the families were going to be able to survive. And so a change not only in the child labor laws, but in the creation of minimum wage standards and things like that was necessary to make it possible for children not to have to work in factories in conditions that were, I mean, it's one thing to have your kids helping you out on the farm, it's something else entirely to send them into a factory or to a coal mine for 12 or 16 hours a day under just absolutely brutal conditions that are deadly by and large over time. And that was the situation that you were seeing, not just in this country, but in most industrialized nations. And so, even if you step further back than that, though, aside from that really abusive period of time, you still see a culture where children were primarily viewed as valuable for what they did, not for what they thought or for what they heard, said, or for just who they were. They were not the joy of your life; they were the burden on your table. That was the reality of the situation, and so having children was important because you needed to have as many of them around as possible to have some of them survive, and to have them work. But you didn't necessarily have them because you just loved having kids. And so we have changed radically as a society when it comes to the importance of children for a variety of reasons. From an advertising standpoint, the thing about children is, I think hopefully all of us are aware, is that they have very little impulse control compared to most adults, not all adults unfortunately, but most, which means that they want to buy everything that you put in front of them that looks like it might be fun. And if you can convince their parents that they have to buy the things their children want, you have the best marketing campaign in the world. And about 40 years ago, a number of companies stumbled into this idea, and this really began the process of revolutionizing the importance of children in our society. And because they were the chief consumers of a lot of goods that you could never get adults to consume, it became necessary to elevate them to a status in our society that was out of proportion to their actual significance. Because they can't really afford to buy all this stuff, but we need their parents to buy it for them, so we have to make them think the kids are really, really important. And so there's this whole kind of warping of the way we look at children, and it was followed on by popular culture. It was followed on then by the psychologists and those kinds of things who have been telling us now for 40 or 50 years that we're doing it all wrong with our kids and that we need to make everything about them and we need to figure out how to do everything the way that they want to do it and the way that's best for them to learn and the way that's best for them to grow, instead of recognizing that actually that may be unhealthy, because if we just let them do it the way they want to, they turn into what we've got now, which is pretty much exactly what you expect. So, go ahead.
Pushing no discipline.
Well, yes, or at least discipline that is harmonious with what the child wants. Well, guess what the child wants? They don't want any discipline. So, Sylvia?
In those days, the children were their social security.
Yes.
That's the only way you would survive and your business would survive. And then, I don't know with the Gentiles, but the Jewish children, when I grew up still then, a lot of them, they got married. They were promised, and a lot of gods in the clan and what they did, And so that was a very different dynamic than we have today.
Yes.
I mean, you don't go today and say to the child, you're promised to him, or it's, even though they could say no, but yeah, and then that comes honor your father and mother. It might have, that some did marry because of honoring the father and mother, even that they could say, no, I don't want this guy.
Yeah. Yeah, there and it isn't just a Jewish thing. There are a number of cultures throughout the world that has continued to be a part of, and even more that it has historically been a part of. To a significant extent, children were viewed as business transactions when it was came time to marry them. How valuable is this person, and what are you going to have to pay to marry, or to have to marry off this particular child and stuff like that. And so, there's definitely a very different mindset that we have about children today, and that leads to a very different mindset that children have about their parents today as well. Barbara?
Well, the other thing too is they didn't have rest homes or things like that
Right.
you could go into then. you know, the children were the ones that took care of
Right.
their parents when they got older, and just like, you know, that if the widows had a family, they were supposed to take care of them.
Right.
You know, and then the church took care of them if they didn't have
Right.
a family. But you know, it would have been up to the children to take care of the parents.
And that's kind of, I
This
think,
society doesn't
right.
necessarily do that.
And I think that's part of what Sylvia was mentioning
Yeah.
when she said that the children were like their social security program.
Yeah.
They were also their old folks home or their rest home or whatever
Yeah.
as well, because yeah, you didn't have any sort of social security net. I don't mean social security in the capitalized sense. I mean any sort of within society, the Jews had a certain number of rules set up, you know, for widows and orphans and stuff like that. But part of the problem from the Jewish standpoint was that those rules were centered around a farming society. And as they had moved increasingly away from a farming society, if you were a widow who lived in a city, you couldn't exactly go out and glean in you know, the fields when they weren't anywhere near the city, you know. And so a lot of these kinds of provisions were gradually falling apart, and that's why the church had to step in so vigorously to help out with widows and those in need. And why also I think Paul and other writers did make such a point of saying, hey, if you've got, you know, if you're a widow and you have family, or if you're a family and you have a widow, you need to take care of her. And if you're a young woman, or you're a woman who's lost her husband young, you need to find ways to get busy and help out. You can't just sit around and let people take care of you, because the system isn't designed to handle all of that. Now, you didn't say that last part. That's actually the lawyer in me saying that part of it. But the fact is that this situation with the relationship between parents and children and parents during this period of time really stayed relatively similar up until very, very recently by human history standards. It's really not until the last 100 years, and even really less than that, but the middle part of the 20th century that we start to see significant differences. And really it's kind of after the World War I era where you really start to see it, because in America after World War I, we had an enormous prosperity going on. We were the most powerful economic nation. I didn't realize this until I started teaching history, which is a little sad, I suppose, but we were the most powerful economic nation in the world leading into World War I already. We didn't have much of a military because we didn't have anybody to fight. It's pretty nice when you live on your own continent, and the only people north of you are your friends, and the people south of you have no army to speak of either. You can kind of do what you want to with your money. And we used it to build up our industry and business and make more and more money. And so the reason that the powers of Europe were worried about America becoming involved in World War I wasn't because we had a big military. It was because they knew that we could turn our resources into a big military if we had to. So when we did go fight in the war at the point that it was, you know, 2/3 of the way over, we didn't lose nearly as much as most of the rest of the world did. And so we came back home, and our industry and our economics just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And we had this massive run of prosperity leading into, of course, the Great Depression, where it all fell apart. But it was during that period of time that you really first start to see dedicated industries catering to children, and dedicated actual advertising in newspapers and radio and some of those kinds of things that are focused on what children might want. Partly things like the kind of food to feed them and those kinds of things, but also things that are focused on toys and those kinds of stuff. And so you begin to see these inroads made, but it's really not even until after World War II that you see the really big shift happening, where there is this movement towards viewing children not as little adults who haven't grown into their, you know, under their britches yet, or as assets to be used until they are old enough to be useful in a broader sense, but you start to see this idea that they have to be treated differently and separately and specially, and there need to be special rules, and there need to be, we need to sort of do what they want. Not just what's best for them, but what they want, rather than what we think is best for them, what adults think is best for them. Jerry?
I was just thinking, there's 20 years difference between me and my youngest brothers and sisters. And I was born in 1943, and they were born in 63.
Wow.
So that, you know, that's
a generation right
I can see that.
Yeah.
The older kids were always accusing my parents of being lax on the little ones, as they weren't on us.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, we're right in that notch of what you're talking about.
I mean, you're two generations. Your
That's
brother,
right.
you and your brothers
That's
are
right.
two generations, and that's exactly it. You have this shift in the way that we look at things and think about things when it comes to children. And instead of thinking in terms of how do they fit into our world, we start thinking, how do we make the world fit for them? How do we, change things? And you look at some of the books that talk about how you're supposed to raise children, how you're supposed to teach children, and increasingly over the period of time from the 50s and 60s to today, they have been increasingly catering to whatever children want, looking for ways to reach children when that was never a problem before. There's a very different mindset. And so today we live in a world in which what children want is oftentimes placed ahead of what adults want and need. And that's just the reality of the situation that we're in. And we see that we have a culture that caters to the very young. I don't mean like infants very young, I mean children and young adults. To the point where, which is also kind of bizarre when you think about it, because actually, financially speaking, you guys are way more up, you have way more assets than the average person in their 20s or 30s, and certainly far more than any underage child has. But the difference is that you all aren't stupid. Or maybe the better way to say it is that you all have developed a certain wisdom in using your money, which is why you have it. Whereas people who are teenagers and now in their 20s and 30s in many cases have developed no such wisdom. And so
plastic.
What's that? The wisdom of plastic, yes. The reality is that these younger generations have failed to develop the kinds of wisdom, or in some cases you wouldn't expect a 12-year-old to have a lot of wisdom yet anyway, but they don't have that wisdom yet. And because of that, the industry knows that the best place to advertise is to people who will buy without thinking. You don't want to spend a lot of your money on your advertising dollars on people who think before they buy, because advertising works less well on them. And by the same token, when you think about psychology, when you think about just so many different aspects of our society, in general, as you get older, you become less vulnerable to manipulation by those things. Now, the one exception seems to be, for some reason, telemarketing scams, and I don't understand what's wrong with all of you, but for some reason, you all seem to fall prey to those with alarming regularity compared to the younger generations. But in general, when it comes to thinking things through and making smart decisions, older is almost always better. And so as we get older, we tend to make fewer bad decisions in general. We tend to be wiser about how we do things. And because of that, our society finds it increasingly difficult to deal with people who are older and wiser. Because the therapist who has some crazy idea and tries to pawn it off on someone who's 20 years old might work, but you try it on somebody who's 50 or 60 years old and knows that it's a load of bunk, it's not going to go anywhere, And so a lot of these things that have transitioned, it's not really, if you break it down, it's not really about wanting to do what's best for the children. It's about wanting to take advantage of the fact that children are vulnerable and that parents increasingly are unwilling or unable to say no to children. And so our society has changed its view of children in a broad sense in response to what a limited group of people have been doing for their own benefit. And it's really, really unhealthy in a very broad sense, because it prioritizes the people who are the least able to make good decisions and puts them in charge of the decision-making process, which is absolutely bizarre, although it follows our political situation, so I guess it makes sense in that regard anyway. But this is where we're at. And so when we encounter passages like this, telling children to obey their parents, it almost sounds archaic. The notion of children obeying their parents seems ridiculous, when these days it's a lot more like, parents, make sure you do whatever your kids want or you're never going to have peace again. That should be the rule, but it's not a good rule.
Is it mainly that way just here in the United States, or is that a general thing all over?
Well, as with so many other things that we exported from this country in the 70s and 80s, it's all over now.
It's all over.
It is not as pervasive everywhere, but when you look, it's exactly what you'd expect when you look around the world, though. Western nations that tend to be more like us culturally anyway have adopted it much more readily. Other nations that are different from us have adopted it more slowly. But at this point, some of the most authoritarian, by that I mean authority-based, parental-based societies in the world, like Japan and China, now have huge amounts of problems with younger generations, young adults and children who are completely non-responsive to what their parents want. And so when you reach a point where you've permeated even those societies, you've pretty much gone global with the trend. So it began here, but it has certainly gone throughout the world. Jerry?
I'm in the middle of Psalms right now, or Proverbs, and you know, almost every chapter Solomon refers to this idea of the kids respecting the parents. I mean, it's a repeated proverb that he comes up with in different ways of saying it, but it's the same idea.
Yeah. Ian?
Well, take heed, not all of us, okay?
Right.
What I was gonna say though is the same goes for bringing your kids up in the Word goes for the same as, you know, them going through the public education system.
Yeah.
Their first line of defense as far as education, both in public education and in the Word, ought to come from the parents. That is where they learn. And I like what Jerry said about this is an idea. This is not necessarily just a group of words. It's not something that we read over and over and over again just to hammer it in. It's an idea. This idea is reinforced every single day of these kids' lives.
Yeah. And that's an interesting little, you bring out a little note that I think is worth pointing out. A lot of parents today, Christian parents, will talk about that they really want the Bible to get back into the classroom. They want, you know, Bible messages and even Bible teaching. They want Bibles in the libraries. The problem with that kind of thinking isn't that there's anything wrong with having the Bible in schools, although there are definitely some parts of the Old Testament that I wouldn't want a 5-year-old reading unless I had a chance to explain it to them first. But for that matter, some of the New Testament even. So I think we need to be a little careful about how just completely unthinking we are about even that position. But in particular, you know, when you see somebody says, well, we need the Bible back into classrooms, we need to be teaching moral lessons. Who is going to be teaching those moral lessons? You're going to have teachers teaching those moral lessons, and those teachers are they don't all think the same thing that you think, or that I think. They don't all approach moral lessons or even the Bible with the same mindset that you or I think. Would you really want, and I'm just using a very broad example here, would you really want a Christian Scientist teaching your children biblical principles in the school? Where they're teaching them, you know, that science is bad and that, you know, you should never go to a doctor, you should just let it solve itself and things like that. Would you want someone from a radically different Christian faith, or what if it's someone who's from a Muslim faith and they're teaching, you know, moral principles, but some of those moral principles are derived from and lead to some very different places than the principles that we have. So, as Ian says, I think to me, what I have seen happen over my 50 years on this planet is not just children being given license to run free, but parents beginning to say, you know what, it's easier that way anyway. Let's let the schools take care of it. Let's get the schools teach them. Well, they're not teaching them what we want them to teach them. There's something wrong with our schools. You know, we need teachers who will teach them what we want them to learn. Well, if you really want them to learn it and you think it's so important to have your perspective, then you're going to have to teach it to them. Because nobody else has your perspective exactly. Nobody else has your background exactly. Now that doesn't mean you have to take them out of schools and put them into homeschooling. I don't think that's necessary, although in some cases it may be advisable. But it does mean that you need to be knowing what they're learning in school. That you need to be teaching them moral lessons as well as practical lessons outside of school. That you need to be backstopping, as Ian says, everything that goes on in their lives, and that takes time and that takes effort. And I know I'm talking mostly to a bunch of people who are done with that part of their job. So I'm not talking about you specifically when I use that term. I'm talking about Christians in general, and this tendency that we have to sort of jump up on our soapbox and say the public school system is failing our kids. When the reality is that the first point that's failing is not the public school system, it's the parental system not taking responsibility the way it has historically. And so the breakdown hasn't just been with the way children relate to their parents, it's been with the way the parents take responsibility for their children, because this has always been a two-way street. One side of the equation can't get too far out of balance if you're following the rules, because one side of the equation gets killed off if it gets too far out of balance if you're following the old rules. So in any event though, when you have control over your children's decision making to a significant extent, there's really no basis to say that you have no way to get them to do anything you're telling them. It may be hard, and there may be some children that it's really, really hard with. But when it comes to young children, at least, we always have a significant amount of influence over them if we're willing to put in the time and the effort. And that's where things get really problematic, is the whole time and effort.
And I think a big part is because today respect gotten away. When I grew up, and I think most of here, I grew up in Switzerland, but if you would go to school and talk back to the teacher, oh my goodness, what happened to you? Today, they have to take it. They cannot say anything back to that rowdy child. So it got a shift there where some is on the school, but not everything. You know, it's just hard because there is no respect. We did respect our elders.
Yes, and this. So what we're really getting to it, and what we're getting to with all this, is that the problem we're talking about here, it's easy to quickly see that this goes way beyond just parents and children, and it goes to a breakdown, as Sylvia says, of respect or of authority relationships in general. And so on the one hand, we have the thing with parents and children, and this ends with Paul's statement, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So one of the things that Paul is highlighting here is that part of the responsibility, a big part of the responsibility of parents in this relationship, is to parent in a way that is Christ-like, is God-centered, is not me-centered or arbitrary or chaotic. Imagine if God were arbitrary or chaotic or acted in anger and without thinking the way parents sometimes do. You know, and I get it, we're human. I get frustrated with my dog sometimes. I'm sure that you guys got frustrated with your kids sometimes, and you react wrong. You know, you yell when you shouldn't, you say something you shouldn't, you do something you shouldn't. God never does. More than that, though, we never have to worry that God is going to just start randomly doing things to amuse himself that are bad for us. You know, just, starting thunderstorms just to see if he can flood out a small community or something like that. You know, turn off gravity for 10 seconds in some part of the planet. You know, imagine if that happened. Just, everybody starts, everything just starts floating, Imagine what the world would be like if our God was like the gods that the Greeks had, where they were capricious and arbitrary and selfish and self-centered. And he's not like that. But what's difficult, the challenge for parents is to model that in the way that they deal with their kids. And so when we talk about not provoking your children to anger, but bringing them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord, it's that consistency, it's putting before them the right thing to do, it's modeling it, it's disciplining them, it's all that stuff that's focused on the right way to do things. So this is a two-way street. Children are supposed to respect authority, but authority, if it's going to work, it needs to be godly in its use and in its application and what it's teaching. And if that's not happening, then even if you get children who are respectful, what you will eventually get, and what happened, quite frankly, during the 60s and 70s, was you had a generation who began to realize that what their parents were saying and doing didn't line up. That they were talking about an America that they weren't living. And I mean, think about, we're talking about America, we've won the war, we've freed Europe, we're all about freedom and equality, and then a new generation grows up around black people and realizes that not for them. We're not about freedom and equality, and they start recognizing that there's some real problems with our society that older generation won't talk about and won't acknowledge and won't deal with, and respect starts to crumble at that point because you no longer have consistency between what you say and do. It's not an excuse; it's simply an observation that this is a two-way street. So when we start to look at this principle of obeying your parents and the Lord, what we have to recognize is that it's not simply a principle that's rooted in parents and children, but it's rooted in the existence of authority and the responses that we have to authority on every level. And unfortunately, the very next one that Paul gets into in Ephesians is the one that we least like to talk about in this country because we don't have the best history with this particular concept. He says, slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in the sincerity of your heart as to Christ. So he immediately transitions to another kind of authority, to one of the most clear kinds of authority in his system at least, because it's the one under which you have the least possibility of not doing what your master, what the authority figure wants. Now, briefly, we need to understand the difference between slavery here and slavery in this country, in the history of this country. Ian?
Not to throw a wrench in the works here, but the ESV version translates that to bondservants.
Yeah, because it sounds nicer.
Is that what
But
it
it
is?
means the same thing.
Is it?
Yeah,
Well-
there's other passages that talk about we are bondservants of Jesus. It's the same word that's used other places to call us slaves of righteousness.
Isn't like a bondservant something that you would enter into willingly to pay off a debt?
Conceivably, but not entirely,
Not
not
okay.
always. But yes, that gets to the point that I'm getting at, though. So basically, in the period of time that we're dealing with here, there were two particular kinds of slavery. Within the Jewish system, the only kind of slavery that existed, for the most part, was, by this time anyway, was slavery where someone sold themselves to pay off a debt, as Ian has identified, or had themselves sold to pay off a debt, as, for example, in the story of the king who forgave the huge debt, and then the servant would not forgive and threw the guy in prison, and then he got thrown in prison. Someone in authority has the right to do that, and so you could be in prison for a debt that you failed to pay, but it would be something that you had, a situation that you had a hand in creating. It wasn't simply that somebody could arbitrarily just come along and kidnap you and take you as slave. There had to be a debt that was being paid off. And more often than not, it was actually a relatively voluntary process, although not always. Whole families could be sold into slavery to pay off debts in some situations. So that was actually something that could happen. The other kind of slavery that did happen during this period of time outside of the Jewish situation and had historically happened under the Jews was slavery by conquest, where a group of people, the Romans for example, might capture an area, and because of a particularly rebellious group of people there, they might take them slaves basically, or they might take some percentage of them as slaves. In some cases they would call that hostages, where they were basically ensuring the good behavior of the rest of their people by taking people hostages. In particular, if you go all the way back to the Babylonians, that is essentially what happened with Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and a number of the important, prominent royal people in Israel when the Babylonians conquered them, as they were taken into captivity, not initially at least. Eventually the entire land was taken into captivity because they couldn't be controlled. But initially at least, Daniel and some of the others were taken as hostages to ensure the good behavior of the Jews back home. Turned out that wasn't a particularly effective way of ensuring their behavior, so the Babylonians went back a few years later and took everybody else into captivity as well. So there was an element of that that went on and continued to go on during the Roman Empire. But there was a couple of really big differences. One of them was that very rarely was slavery race-based, in the sense that an entire race was viewed as being worthy of enslavement. When the Romans would capture another nation, it wasn't really a question of, well, are they the same race as we are? It's really a question of, will they surrender or not? If they will, then we don't have to do this. If they won't, then we're going to take some of them captive. And that frequently meant that the people they took captive were the least like them, more likely to be of a different race, because those people had the hardest time adapting to Roman customs. But nevertheless, it was not a racial-based focus. It was based on conquest. And by the same token, that was also obviously true of the Jewish kind, where it had nothing to do with your race at all. It simply had to do with the debts that you'd accumulated. So one of the big differences is race. The other big difference, and this is the most critical one of all that you have to understand, is the difference between single-generation slavery and generational slavery. And all of the kinds of slavery that I'm talking about in the historical past have been single-generation slavery. Once you get past the Old Testament era, where you actually did have whole nations being taken into slavery, like the Jews had been, like some of the Canaanite peoples were under them, by the time you get into the first century era, you don't have generational slavery, with very, very few exceptions. You have simply, so if you incur a huge debt, you might have to sell yourself into slavery, you might even have to sell your children into slavery, but anybody that comes out of that is not going to be a slave. They may be the lowest class citizen you can get, but you're not going to be a slave. Same thing for the conquered nations. Children and succeeding generations were not slaves simply because their parents had been taken captive. In the United States, as well as in Europe and other places where African slavery was put into place, laws were passed very quickly on that specifically stated that slavery was generational. That if you were a slave, your children were a slave. Unless they were expressly freed under certain circumstances, they were slaves. And so when you talk about the slavery in the 17 and 1800s, you're talking about a very much more insidious and unending kind of slavery than the kind of slavery that you see in the scriptures. So I say all that not to say that that means that the rules that Paul is articulating here would not apply to the more modern version of slavery, but rather to say that when Paul wrote this, he was not writing to a bunch of people who had decided to take an entire race captive and make them do whatever they wanted to forever. And the people who tried to argue using this passage that slavery was something that was instituted by God or was intended by the Bible were doing so with a deliberately misleading view of history and a deliberate misrepresentation of what was really going on. And so to argue that they had an excuse out of this for what they did is simply wrong. That said, the notion of how we respond to authority, and as we'll see as we continue through this, when you talk about even the authority of governments that may not be at all democratic or fair or right or anything else, it's clear, it seems clear that this principle would have carried over into the more modern version of slavery. The idea that you're supposed to respect and to obey your authority figures, no matter how unfair that form of authority might be. And how that applies to things like the Underground Railroad and to different aspects of the attempt to escape from slavery, I'm not going to try to get into today because that is way beyond the purview of this class. I've already gone way beyond the purview of this class. But nevertheless, what he says here that's important is, he says, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, who are your physical masters. Notice that, that's an important distinction. Because what he's saying is they are your masters, but they are your masters only as far as the body goes. As far as the soul goes, as far as the commandments and righteousness goes, they don't trump what God wants you to do. But he says, obey them with fear and trembling in the sincerity of your heart as to Christ. So he's not saying be afraid and be trembling because they have power over you. He's saying obey them with the same kind of reverence that you would have for God, not because they can hurt you, but because they are in authority over you. And so we respect authority. We honor the authority that's over us. Okay. Comments about that? Steve?
Well, I just kind of seem to have a thought here that this whole section of chapter 6 through verse 9 is speaking of two principles that are parallel. So children and slaves are the parallel. Honor, obedience is the parallel. Fathers don't provoke. Masters don't be cruel.
Which we see in Philemon, even if it's not expressly stated
Yes.
here. Yeah.
And so obey the authority that's above you. So the principles of that is what we need to glean out of this, and maybe not try and look at every single word as a nuance of some specific thing that he wants. Romans chapter 1, I think verse 21, talks about the futility of men or mankind as they dishonor God. That the two faults that are named there is they fail to honor God and they fail to give thanks. That's the two things. And here we see the word honor. If we fail to honor God, if we fail to honor our fathers and mothers, if we fail to honor those we have authority over, then we're failing God.
Yes. Yes. And so if we continue this, we continue to see more of these relationship-based discussions. So we go on and he says, actually, sorry, I'm jumping to a different passage, but go ahead.
Just like Paul says in Romans 12, that God, or Romans 13, excuse me, establishes civil authority. God is the ultimate source for how you respect and respond to authority. He is the one that has set it up. He is the one that's modeled how it is done perfectly. And we should emulate that to the extent that we can and train those who are under our authority to react in the same way that Paul talks about children and slaves.
Yes. Any more thoughts before I move on? Because I realize I had that.
Just carrying Steve's comment a little further, the idea of the principle in here would apply also to the idea of employment, working with your boss, that authority there, as well as doing the job that God wants you to do. And
I think it's interesting. Now, we spoke a little bit earlier about the horrific conditions you had in employment in what would have been the early 1800s, late 1700s. Today, I find it hard to accept people who are disrespectful of their employers or who don't do their job, or who, you know, take advantage of opportunities to slack off or to, you know, misuse their job and stuff like that. Because by and large, the working environment that we have in this country is so much better than it has been historically for almost all of humanity. And here we are, you know, bad-mouthing our bosses and taking advantage of our employers and stuff like that. And that's pretty hard for me to look at and say, oh, this is a great situation, you know. We see that a lot, and you know, you go from slaves who are supposed to be obedient to their masters, and here we are, we get paid, and we sometimes don't want to be obedient, don't want to do what we're asked to do. It's a little bit hard to understand the mindset that goes into that, but it ties right into everything else we've been talking about.
You gotta remember Joseph was a slave.
That's right, he was, yeah. Okay, so when we switch over then, here we are talking about slaves again, but this time we're also talking about wives, and two different things. I didn't mean to equate the two things, but I just want to point out that he's talking about authority figures in here. So he says, wives, be subject to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be embittered against them. Children, be obedient to your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing to the Lord. Fathers, do not exasperate your children so that they will not lose heart. So we see a lot of reciprocal responsibilities here, but he begins in both cases, whether it's talking about wives and husbands or children and parents, with the authority relationship, which is that wives are in subject to their husbands. And Ken mentioned, I think it was you that mentioned the role of the father or the male as the spiritual leader last week. And that we see that over and over again. We're not going to go into that in great detail in this class because that could take us down a rabbit hole I don't want to go down today. But the simple fact is we see over and over again the concept of male spiritual authority in the family unit especially modeled in the scriptures. And so there is an expectation that there is an authority set up and that the husband is the lead spiritual authority, and the wife is to be subject to that. That doesn't mean that the wife doesn't have rules, and it doesn't mean that the husband isn't supposed to listen to the wives. It's just the opposite. It says love your wives. If you love somebody, you're probably going to listen to them. You're going to pay attention to what they think and what they want and their ideas, and you're going to incorporate those things. But nevertheless, when the final decision has to be made, there is a chain of command. There is an authority here. And by the same token, when we see this already, the children and their parents, there is a clear set of authority. Parents have authority over their children. The flip side of that, just like with husbands loving their wives and not being embittered against them, is that fathers, and again, it's interesting, he uses fathers, not parents. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Very much the same kind of thing as we see there. Don't frustrate them, don't wear them out unnecessarily so that they will not lose heart. This is the problem you have when you have someone who's trying to do what God wants and someone else who's taking advantage of authority that they held over them, because it's very easy to abuse that authority. That was exactly what many of the slave owners in the South did, was that they used this idea. They were eager to convert as many of their African American slaves to Christianity as possible, because once they were converted to that, then they could say, see, you're supposed to do what I tell you to, no matter how unreasonable or awful the thing that I'm saying to you might be. Well, it's easy for parents in a position of authority to do that as well under some circumstances. And we have to be very careful that we don't do that. We don't misuse our authority, just as God doesn't misuse his authority. But here again, there's no caveat, there's no out, there's no, okay, well, if they don't follow the rules, you don't have to follow the rules. You know, if your children aren't honoring you, you don't have to not exasperate them. More importantly, if your parents are not being godlike in the way they use their authority, doesn't mean you get to say, all right, I'm out of this, I don't have to follow the rules anymore. There's never that exemption. Sylvia?
Especially in those days, and actually also today, that he speaks about fathers, it's because the man of the household is responsible for the spiritual well-being and growing in today Christ, God. That was the man's to do, not the women.
Yes.
They had the responsibility to it. The women were actually exempt from it.
I don't know that I would
The
go quite that far.
responsibility that they grew up in.
So the husbands were held responsible, the fathers were held responsible for what their children did. That didn't mean that mothers did not take a significant role in raising their children in spiritual ways.
Thing,
but the ultimate responsibility is the father, I think. Anyway, we're going to have to stop here. I'll finish with the observation. The slave thing, the thing talking about slaves here is exactly the same functionally as the one I mentioned earlier. obeying your masters, not just externally, but as not just to please men, but with sincerity of heart. Fearing the Lord. So your obedience to your masters is not out of fear for what they can do, it's out of fear for the Lord and reverence for the Lord. Okay, we're going to stop there. We're going to pick up next week and we're going to ask a question that's going to get real fun.